Just when Margaret believes her father's final secret has been uncovered. Workers renovating the old drive-in discover a sealed projection booth that doesn't appear on any original blueprint. Hidden inside is an untouched film reel labeled, "Play this only after I'm gone." But when they finally project the film onto the giant screen, the first person to appear isn't her father. It's Richard, filmed decades before anyone knew the divorce would ever happen. Before we jump into today's incredible story, make sure to join our YouTube family by hitting the subscribe button. If you enjoy emotional stories filled with shocking twists, hidden secrets, and unforgettable endings, don't forget to like this video. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Now, get comfortable, because today's story is about a woman who thought she had lost everything after a painful divorce, until the forgotten drive-in theater her father secretly left behind became the one thing that changed her life forever. Let's get into the story. Margaret Lawson stood quietly on the courthouse steps with a small leather handbag hanging from her shoulder, and a thin folder of divorce papers pressed against her chest. 34 years. That was how long her marriage had lasted. 34 years of birthdays, anniversaries, family vacations, business meetings, late-night conversations, and promises that now felt like they had belonged to someone else. The judge had spoken the final words only minutes earlier. The marriage was over. Margaret should have cried. Instead, she simply stared at the parking lot where her ex-husband, Richard, was shaking hands with his attorney. He looked relieved, victorious, almost proud. He noticed Margaret watching him and smiled before walking toward the luxury SUV they had once purchased together. "I told you," he said as he opened the driver's door. "You never would have had any of this without me." Then he climbed inside and drove away without another glance. Margaret remained standing alone. The parking lot slowly emptied until only her aging sedan remained. She climbed inside and rested both hands on the steering wheel. For several long moments, she didn't start the engine. Instead, she closed her eyes. She wasn't grieving the marriage. She had already done that months earlier. What hurt most was realizing how carefully Richard had planned everything. Years before the divorce, he had quietly transferred company shares into separate accounts. He had hidden investments, moved assets, prepared expensive lawyers. While Margaret believed they were working together, Richard had quietly been preparing to leave. When the divorce finally arrived, the courtroom became nothing more than the final step of a plan he had spent years creating. He kept the house, the business, the vacation property, their retirement savings, nearly everything. Friends she had known for decades slowly stopped calling. Some believed Richard's version of events. Others simply chose the easier side. By the end of the month, Margaret found herself renting a tiny apartment above an old bakery. The apartment was clean but small. Every morning the smell of fresh bread drifted through the floorboards. Normally she would have loved it. Now it only reminded her that life had become something completely unfamiliar. She spent her mornings searching for work, her afternoons sending applications, her evenings staring out the apartment window wondering how life could change so completely after 58 years. One rainy Tuesday, while sorting through boxes of old family photographs, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Instead, she answered. "Margaret Lawson." "Yes. My name is Thomas Avery. I handled part of your father's estate many years ago." Margaret frowned. "My father's estate was settled after he passed." "Not entirely." Those two words instantly caught her attention. "What do you mean?" "There is one remaining property. It legally belongs only to you." Confused, Margaret agreed to meet him the next morning. Thomas greeted her warmly inside his small law office. He seemed older than she remembered. Gray hair. Kind eyes. The same gentle voice her father had trusted decades earlier. Without saying much, he placed a weathered folder onto the desk. Inside rested an old property deed. Margaret looked down. Then froze. The address felt impossible. No. Thomas smiled softly. You recognize it. My father's drive-in theater. She whispered the words almost to herself. I thought it was gone. It was never sold. Your father transferred ownership into your name 6 years before your marriage. Margaret looked up. Why would he do that? Thomas leaned back quietly. He told me something I'll never forget. One day my daughter may need a place where no one else remembers to look. Tears slowly filled Margaret's eyes. Even after all these years, her father had somehow protected her. Because the property had always belonged only to her. Richard had never known it existed. It wasn't listed during the divorce. It remained hers alone. The following afternoon, Margaret drove toward the countryside where she had grown up. The roads became quieter. Traffic disappeared. Fields stretched endlessly beneath a bright blue sky. Finally she turned onto an old gravel road. There it was. The drive-in. Time had certainly changed it. The giant movie screen still towered proudly against the sky, though faded white paint peeled from its surface. The ticket booth leaned slightly. Tall grass covered most of the parking area. The snack bar windows were boarded shut. Nature had slowly reclaimed what people had forgotten. Yet somehow, it still felt alive. Margaret parked near the entrance. As she stepped out of the car, memories rushed toward her. She remembered standing beside her father inside the ticket booth collecting admission tickets. She remembered serving popcorn with butter dripping down the sides of cardboard buckets. She remembered children laughing while families watched movies beneath the stars. Friday nights had been magical. Her father always said, "People don't come here just for movies. They come here to make memories." Margaret slowly walked toward the projection building. The heavy wooden door resisted before finally opening. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. Everything remained exactly where it had been decades earlier. Old reels. Projectors. Posters. Even the faded chalkboard listing movie schedules still hung beside the wall. Nothing had moved. It felt as though someone had simply paused time. Then she noticed something waiting atop the projector. A sealed envelope. A cross. The front appeared handwriting she instantly recognized. My dear Maggie. Her hands began trembling. She carefully unfolded the letter. My dear Maggie. If you're reading this, life probably hasn't been kind to you lately. I wish I could stand beside you. Since I can't, I've left you one final lesson. Never measure your future by what someone else takes away. Real treasure is often hidden inside forgotten places. The drive-in was never my greatest investment. Look beneath the projector platform. Everything begins there. Margaret folded the letter carefully. She looked down. The enormous projector rested on a raised wooden platform nearly 2 feet above the floor. At first it appeared ordinary. Then she noticed something unusual. Fresh scratch marks along one edge. Almost invisible beneath decades of dust. Someone had moved this platform before. Very carefully. Heart pounding. Margaret searched the room until she found an old crowbar leaning quietly beside a maintenance shelf. She knelt beside the platform, slipped the crowbar beneath the wooden edge, and pushed. The platform shifted slightly. A deep metallic sound echoed beneath the floor. Margaret stopped moving. There was something underneath. Something her father had hidden so carefully that even 30 years of abandonment hadn't revealed it. She took one deep breath, gripped the crowbar tighter, and pushed again. This time, the entire platform slowly slid aside, revealing an enormous steel hatch built directly into the concrete floor. Bolted across its center was a weathered brass plaque. Only 6 words had been engraved into the metal. Open this only when you're ready. Margaret stared at the steel hatch for a long time without moving. The words on the brass plaque seemed heavier than metal itself. Open this only when you're ready. The silence inside the projection room pressed against her from every direction. Dust drifted slowly through the sunlight like floating memories. Her heart was still racing from discovering the hidden entrance. But now a different feeling began to rise inside her. Fear. Not fear of what she might find, but fear of what it might mean. Her father had never been a man who left things without purpose. Every word he spoke had always carried meaning. Every action had always been deliberate. Which meant this wasn't just a hidden space. It was a decision. A test. Or maybe even a final gift meant only for her. Margaret slowly knelt beside the hatch again. Her fingers brushed across the cold brass letters. For a moment she closed her eyes. She remembered being a child, sitting on the counter of the ticket booth while her father counted cash at the end of long movie nights. He would always pause and look at her before speaking. Life will take things from you, Maggie. But it will also leave things behind. You just have to learn where to look. At the time, she had never understood what he meant. Now, standing in a forgotten drive-in theater at 58 years old, she felt like she was finally beginning to understand. She reached for the rusted handle built into the hatch. It didn't move. The mechanism had clearly been sealed for years. She exhaled slowly and looked around the room. There had to be a tool somewhere. Behind an old cabinet near the wall, she found a heavy iron lever. It looked like it had once belonged to the projection machinery. She returned to the hatch and slid the lever into a narrow groove beside the lock. With both hands, she pressed down. At first, nothing happened. Then a loud metallic groan echoed beneath the floor. The sound was deep. Old. Like something awakening after a very long sleep. The lock released. A sharp click followed. Margaret froze. She had done it. The hatch was no longer sealed. For several seconds she didn't move. The world outside the drive-in felt distant now. Even her divorce. Even Richard. Everything that had once defined her life suddenly felt far away. Slowly, she pulled the hatch open. A rush of cold air rose from below. It carried the scent of stone, metal, and something faintly familiar. Like old paper. Or preserved history. She leaned forward carefully and pointed her flashlight into the darkness. Stone steps descended into what looked like an underground chamber carved beneath the projection room. Her breath caught. This wasn't part of the drive-in. Her father had built something deeper. Something hidden beneath everything else. Step by step, she descended into the darkness. The flashlight beam revealed walls lined with wooden shelves. Each shelf was perfectly arranged. No dust. No decay. Someone had maintained this space with incredible care. Margaret reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. The room was far larger than she expected. A hidden underground archive stretched beneath the entire structure. Shelves held neatly labeled boxes. Old film reels sat inside protective cases. There were documents. Ledgers. Photographs. Blueprints. Everything preserved as if time had never touched it. At the center of the room stood a long wooden table. And on that table, 3 sealed metal boxes rested side by side. Each one had a name engraved on the top. Her father's handwriting. Margaret. Open last. Trust yourself. Her knees nearly weakened. She set her flashlight down and stepped closer. Her fingers hovered over the first box. Then stopped. Something didn't feel right. This wasn't random. It was structured. Carefully designed. Like a sequence. She opened the first box. Inside were financial records. Not just of the drive-in, but of multiple properties she had never known existed. Rental agreements. Deeds. Investment documents. Income reports. Margaret's eyes widened as she read further. Her father had quietly been investing the drive-in profits for decades. Not just preserving them, growing them. The second box contained something even more unexpected. Legal papers. Ownership transfers. Business partnerships. Entire companies she had never heard of. All tied back to her father. And all now legally connected to her. Margaret stepped back slightly, overwhelmed. This can't be real. But the third box remained untouched. The words on top echoed in her mind. Open last. Trust yourself. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. Just before she could open it, a loud sound echoed from upstairs. The drive-in door. It had opened. Someone was inside the building. Footsteps followed. Slow. Intentional. Moving toward the projection room. Margaret froze. She wasn't alone anymore. And whoever had just arrived knew exactly where she was. Margaret immediately switched off her flashlight. Darkness filled the underground chamber. Only a thin beam of sunlight filtered through the open hatch high above. The footsteps upstairs grew louder. Slow. Steady. Deliberate. Someone was walking across the old projection room. Every floorboard creaked beneath their weight. Margaret's heart pounded so loudly. She was certain whoever stood above could hear it. She carefully moved behind one of the large wooden shelving units, holding the unopened metal box tightly against her chest. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed. Then she heard a familiar voice. Margaret. It wasn't Richard. It was Thomas Avery, the attorney. Relief washed over her. She stepped out from behind the shelves. I'm down here. Thomas carefully climbed through the open hatch carrying another lantern. The moment he reached the underground room, he smiled. So, you found it. Margaret looked around in disbelief. You knew this place existed? Thomas nodded slowly. Your father showed it to me nearly 20 years ago. He made me promise never to reveal it unless you discovered it yourself. Margaret looked at the unopened metal box. He planned everything. He certainly did. Thomas walked toward the shelves. There are more than financial records here. Your father spent years preserving this drive-in. He believed people would one day value community again. Margaret slowly opened the final metal box. Inside rested another handwritten letter. Beneath it lay several small keys attached to labeled tags. She unfolded the letter carefully. My dear Maggie. If you've reached this point, then you've already proven something important. You stopped believing what other people said you were worth. That matters more than any fortune. Everything you've discovered belongs to you. But I hope you'll understand something. Money disappears. Buildings grow old. Businesses rise and fall. Communities last forever. This drive-in gave families memories for generations. Promise me you'll give it that chance again. Margaret wiped away quiet tears. She finally understood. The greatest inheritance wasn't hidden underground. It was purpose. For weeks afterward, Margaret worked every day restoring the forgotten drive-in. She hired local contractors, cleaned decades of dust, repaired the giant movie screen, painted the old ticket booth, restored the snack bar. Word slowly spread through the small town. Volunteers appeared. Former employees returned. Older couples shared stories about their first dates beneath the stars. Teenagers offered to help paint fences. Electricians donated time. Carpenters repaired seating. The abandoned property slowly came back to life. 6 months later, opening night finally arrived. Hundreds of cars filled the parking field. Families unfolded lawn chairs. Children laughed exactly as Margaret remembered from childhood. The smell of fresh popcorn drifted through the evening air. Standing beside the ticket booth, Margaret smiled toward the sky. It felt like her father was standing beside her again. News stations covered the reopening. Newspapers called it one of the most inspiring community stories of the year. The forgotten drive-in quickly became one of the region's most popular attractions. Meanwhile, Richard watched everything from a distance. The same woman he claimed could never survive without him, had rebuilt something far greater than either of them ever owned together. One evening he quietly walked onto the property. Margaret recognized him immediately. He looked different. Older. Less confident. He stared across the packed parking lot. "I never imagined this." Margaret smiled gently. "Neither did I." Richard looked toward the glowing movie screen. "I thought I took everything." "You took the things you believed had value." She looked around at the smiling families. "My father left me something better." Richard lowered his head. "I made a terrible mistake." Margaret nodded kindly. "Maybe. But without that mistake, I never would have found this." Richard quietly left. There was nothing more to say. As another movie began beneath the stars, Margaret climbed into the old projection booth. The projector hummed softly. The same sound she remembered hearing as a little girl sitting beside her father. She placed his final letter inside a small wooden frame beside the machine. Every night before starting the first film, she read one sentence: "Communities last forever." Years later, the drive-in became more than a business. It became a tradition once again. Families who had visited as children returned with children of their own. The place everyone believed was forgotten became the heart of the town. Margaret often smiled when people asked how she rebuilt her life after losing everything. She always gave the same answer: "I didn't lose everything. I just hadn't found what truly mattered yet." Richard had walked away believing he won the divorce. But the one thing he never noticed: the forgotten drive-in her father quietly protected, gave Margaret something no courtroom could ever divide. A new beginning. A lasting legacy. And a future brighter than she had ever imagined.